Well, welcome tonight. My name is Michael Steinmacher. I'm the director of the Barr Memorial Library at Fort Knox, Kentucky. Tonight, we are privileged to host John C. McManus. He is the Curators Distinguished Professor of U.S. Military History at Missouri University of Science and Technology. I will say that Mr. McManus's work has been on my radar for a long time as an Army librarian, with his work appearing on the U.S. Army Chief of Staff's reading list, and generally turned to as authoritative history when it comes to people looking for history in the military field. He's one of the nation's leading historians, military historians, and he's the author of 14 books. He is frequently in demand, and you can find him or see him on CNN, Fox News, C-SPAN, the Military Channel, Discovery, National Geographic Channel, Netflix, and Smithsonian Channel. He served as the historical advisor for the best-selling book and documentary Salinger, the latter of which appeared nationwide in theaters and on PBS's American Masters series. In 2018-2019, he was in residence at the U.S. Naval Academy as the Schifrin Chair of the Naval and Military History, a distinguished visitor professorship. His current work is a 3-volume set, the first of which was Fire and Fortitude, the U.S. Army in the Pacific War. Tonight, we are honored to host him and discuss his newest book, Island Infernos. And if you want a chance to win an autographed copy of that, send us another email to Barr Library Events, and we will be sending out some special copies that are autographed, courtesy of Mr. McManus, the publisher, and Barnes & Noble. The book's available at Barnes & Noble and will make a great holiday gift. So without further ado, I just want to welcome John McManus.
Thanks so much, Michael. I appreciate it. Great to be here tonight.
So tonight, if you've joined in the past, we've had several different formats for these virtual author events. And tonight we're basically going to have a little bit of a conversation between me and Mr. McManus. We want it to be interactive, so I definitely want to see your questions in the chat box, because this is one of those things where I'm sure Mr. McManus will agree with me. We've lost the intimacy of being able to do these events in that we normally would have in a venue face to face. So it's really important, if you have something on your mind, to get it in the chat box and we'll get it out there. So my first question is, do you recall when you became first interested in history?
Boy, it'd be a long time ago, not far out of the cradle. I have always been into history. Some of the first books I ever read had to do with World War II. I was heavily influenced, for instance, by Robert Leckie, who, of course, was a Marine in the Pacific and was featured in the miniseries, The Pacific. But he had an incredible career as an author. And he wrote, of course, some very important histories of the various aspects of World War II, but he wrote some books that were geared for young readers. And certainly that appealed to me. And what always animated me in reading Leckie or anybody else, but really more so others than Leckie, was it was difficult to kind of come to grips with what happened for the actual guy at the front line and what that was like. And as I grew older, I came to feel that there wasn't quite enough work geared toward that. So that tended to be my, greatest area of interest. But yeah, really almost ever since I could read, I was kind of into history, believe it or not.
Oh, I definitely believe it. I had a conversation recently about how I've been interested in the Titanic since I can recall at least the third grade. So it's definitely one of those things where you get bit by the bug and you get bit early. We're going to jump around a little bit in this conversation, but I do want to turn to Island Infernos. But I'd like you to talk a little bit about what set the stage for writing Fire and Fortitude, and how you determined that it was a project bigger than one work.
Yeah, one of the things that had occurred to me over the years, being a World War II historian, especially an historian who focuses primarily on the United States experience in World War II, is it occurred to me after I'd done enough books and sort of explored this topic that the Army's role in the Pacific was relatively overlooked and really kind of misunderstood. And there was this kind of popular notion that I think survives even now that when it came to the ground war in the Pacific, the Marines basically did the ground fighting. The Navy kind of did everything else. There were some bombers around, and that's how the war proceeded. But actually, the Army did the vast majority of the fighting and also the other sort of grunt work that had to be done with logistics and engineering and communications and guerrilla warfare and medical issues, all these kinds of things. And I just thought to myself over time, there's a major, major story here and a major element of World War II that I don't think has received the kind of coverage that it deserves. And that's exciting for an historian because you really don't want to just repeat what's already been done. There's nothing interesting or original about that. And there are some events in World War II that I think have been done about as far as they can be. Like the atomic bomb controversy would be an example I'd give you. But the Army, by contrast, wasn't. And so as I got deeper into that, I thought, well, this is a vast, broad scope story, and it really can't, to be done the right way, it can't be done in just one book. And I'm really glad that we approach it that way, because I think that you can really, get immersed in the early stages of the war with Fire and Fortitude. Now, Island Infernos covers 1944. The third volume will cover 1945. The end of the war, and you see the Army's role there too. So you can kind of just see this story progressing. So this has been for me at least about a decade or so of at least of research and writing and traveling and exploring and kind of thinking about this. And it's the other point that I should make is that taking on the Army as a topic, I'm really not hoping or trying to denigrate the Marine Corps at all. And actually, it's really the opposite, because when you look at this more, you see how few Marines there really were, and the kind of broad impact that they had, and the valor, of course, is just off the charts. And what I also found is that, the Army and the Marines are tending to fight shoulder to shoulder. There are very few exclusively Marine battles in all of history, but particularly in World War II in the Pacific. And so I don't believe, just from my own research, that they really fought all that differently. I think they were really quite similar. And I think there was a tremendous and profound respect at the basic level of rifleman to rifleman and whatever else that I think was one of the reasons why the United States did as well as it did in the war.
So, from a publishing and writing standpoint, was this something that you pitched as 3 volumes, or was it
Mm-hmm.
something? Okay.
Yeah, it's funny. It's a funny story. I did pitch it as 3 volumes originally, and my publisher was a little reluctant to do that, and so they proposed 2 volumes. I said, okay, I'll take that on, do the best I can. And so when I turned in the second volume, that was going to be 1944 and 45. Of course, it was enormous. I mean, you're talking about what would end up as probably like an 1,100 or 1,200 page book, and so to their credit, they didn't say, hey, cut this, cut that, and shoehorn it into whatever. No, I mean, they thought, all right, let's go to that trilogy concept. And I'm really excited that we did, because I think this is the right way to tell the story. And I do think sometimes, as you get to the end of the 1944, and even, like with Fire and Fortitude, the end of 43, it's sometimes useful to kind of just pause for air a little bit, because there's a lot going on. There's a lot to digest. It's an incredibly complex and I think fascinating story. And I do think it requires a little bit of pause so that you can digest it in your mind and really, really decide what you think. And so I like that we've come about it this way. I'm glad it's worked out this way.
So, I'm curious too, one of the questions I'm going to have is about you and how your historical theory and how you think the present and the past inform history. But I'm interested right now in knowing, you mentioned the fact that basically at one point it was 2 volumes and then it became the 3 volumes. So essentially, you've constructed it in a 3-act play, for lack of a better
Mm-hmm.
word. So this is the middle act. This is where we reach the high point, and now we're going to be moving down into the third part. Did you find it a challenge to frame the books and be able to tell the individual histories that you did as independent pieces, but part of a bigger whole?
Initially, it is, but what helps you in the end with covering a war like World War II is you have that chronology. And the chronology can give you, as you said, very, very eloquently, that 3-act play. And so it can give you then your kind of framework. And I felt so the harder part was really deciding, okay, where do we cut off in Fire and Fortitude? Where does and I wanted to really to convey that the Army and the Allies have kind of turned the corner at some point and give you a sense of perhaps progression, especially because of course, honestly, a lot of the books are going to be read by an American audience, and a lot of what you're reading in Fire and Fortitude is not terribly upbeat. Kind of story, with the 20,000 American POWs and the horrible POW experience, the defeats in the Philippines, and the rough days early in the war. But you really kind of do see how things change over time and why. So the harder part was deciding, okay, where do we end in Fire and Fortitude? And then after that, most of the rest of it fell into place once we do a trilogy. 1944 requires a story all on its own because, and really this is kind of the nexus and the fulcrum of the war from an American perspective, really both Europe and Pacific Asia. This is when the U.S. really becomes a military superpower. And I think really the best evidence of that is just looking at June 1944 and seeing these vast global commitments that the Normandy invasion, huge and momentous though it was, is just one of our major undertakings. And so, I think that 1944 then kind of writes itself in that regard. And then, of course, the capstone of it in 1945. So, ultimately, it wasn't that difficult to kind of try and separate the story in that respect.
So I'd like to ask you about characters, for lack of a better word, historical figures here. It's really easy, and it's proven pretty popular to lionize some of the more popular historical figures that we know about. But one of the things that you are acclaimed for is telling the story and telling the warts and all of these figures that we've talked about. Can you talk a little bit about how you approach recording historical figures, whether they be the boots on the ground, the rank and file, up to the commanding, the 4-star generals, so on and so forth?
Right. Well, what I hope to do is to give them the fairest shake, to portray them as they were, so much as we possibly can, so much as we're going to understand that all these decades later. You go with the sources you have. And, we all have to, in the end, kind of decide on our own analytical framework of how we view a person like MacArthur, or how we view Captain so-and-so who played a key role at Guadalcanal, or Private so-and-so who was in the battle, or whatever. What I'm trying to do is to kind of demythologize and demystify it, and perhaps, hopefully, maybe put you back in that time and put you in that person's boots and see the issues they dealt with, and to try and have a bit of forbearance and tolerance. And certainly any historian, I think, needs a lot of humility, a major dose of humility, because it's really easy for us to come along later on and say, you should have done this, you should have done that. But also, that is part of your role as an historian, is to kind of critique what you see. And then, leave that for the reader to decide what he or she thinks, based, about what you said. It's the fun of history, is we all may analyze it or look at it differently. So really, all I hope to do is give a fair shake to whomever, and that's not just the American side; it's the Japanese side too. To look at them as what we could think of as the unvarnished truth, whatever that may be, while realizing that we are coming along 70, 80 years later, and we don't necessarily have all the information at our fingertips. We're doing the best we can. So, where you see this shake out a lot is the view of the generals. And of course, the figure of MacArthur being the prime example, to try then give them the fairest shake possible.
So you mentioned the Americans, you mentioned the Japanese, you mentioned giving them a fair shake, and the reality of this situation. One of the things that is a current in your work that's a very popular, unfortunately, issue that we're addressing and wrestling with even today is racism. We're dealing with, we're talking about a segregated military, an American military at this point. We're talking about racism within the ranks of our own. We're also talking about racism aimed toward the enemy. And I'm just curious about your take on how that theme has developed in your work and what kind of role you see it playing in the overall trilogy.
Yeah, I see it as, again, we're trying to look at this as realistically as we can. And this was the America of the time. And really, it's one of the saddest and most profound ironies of World War II is that this country loses 400,000 of its sons, a few of its daughters, to take down some of the most homicidally racist regimes in human history, of which the Japanese regime has to be considered something of that order. And yet it does it with a military force segregated on the basis of race, And so, from an African American perspective, you're left wondering, well, why should I be on board with this? What, if I'm living in Jim Crow, why am I going to fight for this country and all this? And I think when you look at it that deeply, it's like you're amazed at the contributions of African American soldiers, dealing with what they dealt with. The everyday indignities, or even when things were becoming integrated, it's still awkward because you have this kind of racial framework that is trying to separate the races. And so what you see in World War II, and what you really see play out in the Pacific, is that you've got the pro-civil rights movement, which is gaining tremendous momentum. And it's why I personally think World War II is the most important event in American history, in part because of the massive domestic changes you're going to see, most notably the civil rights movement, that probably isn't going to happen in the same way without World War II. And so the 50s and 60s are no accident in that respect. So you're seeing that play out with the more entrenched segregation crowd and the Jim Crow and the kind of white supremacy that some wanted to embrace and continue. And so this affects especially the 93rd Infantry Division on Bougainville, which is an African American division. I mean, of course, we all know the construct. It would be some black officers, but mostly white officers, and it's a combat unit that is thrown in after the worst of the fighting has happened, like in spring of 1944. And their performance is pretty much like any other new division, but they don't really have the luxury of just sort of easing their way into combat, making some mistakes and just kind of learning their way. No, they have to be this sort of microcosm for everything. So anytime they do something right, the pro-civil rights folks are like, look at these guys, they're super soldiers, it's incredible. And you see all this media coverage. And then anytime they do anything wrong, the other side is what wants to jump in. And we all know who has more power at that point in 1944, especially in the Pacific. And of course, from a military command standpoint, do I want to take on this social problem and dilemma, or do I want to fight battles and defeat the enemy? Of course, you know where the priority is. And so no commander wants that headache. And I think it's amazing how fair-minded 14th Corps Commander Oscar Griswold is in dealing with this touchstone of political controversy around the 93rd. But the sad reality is that you end up with this kind of bureaucratic reality and inertia in which African American soldiers are, after that, kind of held out of combat usually and put in, unloading ships and engineering roles and construction and all that. So you do see this, and you see the tension there, especially once you get back to the Philippines, 1944, and especially in 45 in Luzon, whether African American soldiers are going to be treated, with more equality in front of the Filipinos. So you have that dynamic too. So it's just, it's a time of tremendous sadness in that regard, but also I think a great deal of complexity. And again, very easy for me to say from a latter year standpoint, this was wrong, should have been done right. But, you have to, take people as they are at the time, I think is the fairest way.
What do you think about the idea that the period in which we live shapes the way our historians write the work of the time?
I think that's for sure. And I don't think there's much wrong with that in the sense if it brings up new questions to ask, new ways to look at history, things that may have been overlooked that now we see as important, and race maybe being an example. I was always going to, regardless of what was going on in our society in the last decade, I was always going to portray race as much as I could, and still keep on the bigger story of what's happening with the Army and progression of operations and all that, because it's all profoundly relevant and a big part of the Army's experience. But no question that I think it took on a bit more importance, I guess, or immediacy. Maybe that's the better word. And I don't know that there's anything wrong with that. What I think is wrong is that sometimes if we sort of from our latter-day moral perch are just immediately condemning those in the past and saying, no, they're right, they're evil, they're awful, I think you have to have some level of understanding, if not always agreement. There's a very big difference there. And I just think that when you look at history, you have to take people as they were at the time in the context of their time, and yet still not gloss over what are things that are just plain wrong. The White Australia policy, for instance, which I cover in Fire and Fortitude, Australia had this kind of whites only policy. And the Americans were wanting to bring a bunch of African American troops in to do a lot of the engineering duties and construction duties and all that. And so you see this clash at the bureaucratic level with MacArthur saying, "I'm bringing black soldiers in." The Australians not wanting that, but the Americans getting their way. And the irony of ironies is that the Australians end up treating many of these soldiers better than did their fellow white soldiers. So. We can't just look past that. I mean, it's part of what happened and what would have been part of your experience. But also, I like to think it's one of the reasons why we fought World War II as we did. As black leaders at the time called it the Double V program, victory over the Axis, but victory over Jim Crow at home. And I think World War II is one of the things that does that, not just because of black veterans, but some white veterans who are determined to bring about change too. And this includes many, Army soldiers from the Pacific Asia theater.
You had mentioned that this basically has been a 10-year project for you. And a lot of that is undoubtedly the heavy lifting of the research. One of our listeners has asked, how well has the Army documented their actions in the Pacific theater? Is their history as well written and preserved as the history written by the Corps? And my question I'm going to tack onto that is, if the answer is the Corps has done a better job, do you think that is why they are regarded and thought of more in the context of this period we're talking about?
That's a great point. Now, this is sort of always my blanket opinion, so this is just my bias. I think the Marine Corps always does a better job with its history and preserving it than does the Army. Whether we're talking about Belleau Wood, whether we're talking about Tarawa, whether we're talking about Hue or Fallujah or whatever, the Marine Corps is very good at that because in a way it has to. The Marine Corps has to preserve that identity. It, of course, understands keenly how important heritage and lineage is, and that sense of belonging and being part of a brotherhood and sisterhood of Marines of the past. The Army has more to deal with. It's larger, it's more diverse, it has all these different responsibilities, history just being one of them. But having said that, I think the Army does a pretty nice job in the Pacific Theater of preserving its history that we see in the wonderful Green Book official histories. Of course, we all know the operational battle side of them, but there's all these special studies too, which are, of course, of great interest to an historian like me. It's like, here's here's the invasion of Saipan with the 27th Division and all that's going on, but also here's what the engineers are doing, and here's the challenges of the quartermasters and the medical people and just the ordnance people, and all of that I think is profoundly important. And I think there was incredible effort done to preserve that and to tell it in that format. But I do think that the Marine Corps in its official histories, and certainly with its sort of outreach to popular histories of World War II, has generally done a more solid job. But they also tended to fight battles that didn't last as long and were easier to kind of embrace as a narrative, like Tarawa being a really good example. It's easier and I think more desirable for an average reader to kind of settle in for a Tarawa book that that's 76 hours, here's a linear battle, it's awful, but here's how it goes out, versus dealing with Leyte, which is the endpoint of Island Infernos and is an enormous battle that drags on for weeks and weeks and weeks. That really is quite similar to what you see like in Italy or in the European theater. Hardly anybody remembers the Colmar Pocket or the Hurtgen Forest or something, and so Leyte comes more in that column. And I think that's always a little bit of a tougher sell historically, especially, to an average reader. And I get that. I think, one of the things that really interested me and animated me was using a lot of the original material that these historians had done, the Army official historians of the time. Incredible, like, after action group interviews or, on the site reports, impressions they made, correspondence that they had among themselves. Really cool stuff. That's like the primary source material that the green books are eventually based on. So you're kind of going to the source there. I found the diaries and journals of several of the combat historians who were embedded with divisions at Okinawa, for instance, and you'll see that in the next book, in the third volume. One of whom was a guy named James McGregor Burns, who was possibly FDR's most famous biographer. So it really, I think, begins to sort of unravel this sort of deeper side of the war, I guess.
So just a reminder, if anybody has any questions, please put them in the chat. Otherwise, you're going to have to keep listening to my questions and what I want to know. So here's an observation that I want to share with you, John. I personally find the entire way we view the Army in the Pacific interesting, considering that it's what might be considered the first major action to be Aleutian battles as an Army-only action.
It's you mean the Aleutian Islands as an Army-only operation?
Yes.
Well, previously in New Guinea, you'd had that before, like General Eichelberger's battle at Buna. It has just the 32nd Infantry Division, and then a little farther up the coast, you have the 41st Division. You don't really have any Marine participation there, so that does kind of sets the stage for what you're going to see in May of '43 at Attu, the invasion of Attu by the 7th Infantry Division, which is a very, very tough fight. And it's the only battle in the Pacific War in which you have a kind of cold weather element. It's not freezing or sub-freezing at the time the battle's fought, but it's unpleasant. It's 40 degrees and rainy and misty and nasty, and you have this this unique terrain called the Muskeg, which is like this uniquely marshy terrain that's hard to walk in, much less move vehicles. The Japanese have built into some of the ridge lines and mountainous areas that are overlooking the low ground, and they fight to the death. And it is a ferocious battle in which the casualty rates for the Americans are near the highest in all of World War II. Attu, I think, does tend to get forgotten a little bit because it's so anomalous to much of the rest of the Pacific. Most of the rest of the Pacific, we're hot and we're sweating and we're dealing with a tropical climate. Not in the Aleutians, that's for sure.
So you alluded to this a little bit earlier, but I'd kind of like to get you to elaborate upon it. Where do you find the inspiration to do the heavy lifting that we're talking about? Basically taking on a 10-year huge project, and where does that inspiration come from?
If I think there's something original there, something that I find very exciting. It's exciting to me to realize that, this is the third largest army this country has ever sent overseas to fight a war. That's 1.8 million American ground soldiers serve in the Pacific and Asia. And I mean, when you consider how anonymous that army is relative to its profound importance, I don't know that you could want anything more as an historian. So that, in a way, that's what really excites me. But the other thing too, the source material has to be there and accessible, because I mentioned, anybody can just go and look in somebody else's book and recycle that, but that's profoundly boring. So what you really want is to go in and find the original stuff. Maybe even sources that have never been used or have been underutilized or lost or whatever it would be. I mean, that's really where you get this kind of sense of, staying with something for a decade plus. And I fully anticipate that, that once all three books are out, I'm sure I'll be continuing to learn more that I didn't know. To me, this is such a vast topic that I view my trilogy as this the sort of the first word on it. I'm sure there'll be others who come along who say, hey, what about that aspect, or what about this, or you overlooked that, or what, I'm sure. So I hope it really stimulates a long discussion and kind of just maybe reshapes our view of the war against Japan, in the sense of just appreciating what actually went on. And that when we look at the experiences of this army, we can learn a lot of lessons that I think are still with us today.
Did you discover along the way anything that was a particular, what I would call a wow moment in this research?
Yeah, one of the things that I didn't realize the scope of, and you don't until you're really working deeply in this world and with these sources. I did not realize the copious amounts of translated Japanese soldier diaries that exist in American and Australian records. And the reason they exist is because MacArthur had a really vast intel section that had a component that was called the Allied Translation and Interpreter section. And so what they were doing was, of course, certainly a lot of like intel and code breaking and that kind of thing. But they were taking a lot of this raw material that was captured from the Japanese, some of it just operational documents and stuff that's not that interesting, but a lot of it soldier diaries that are there because of the culture of the Imperial Japanese Army, because the Army doesn't expect its guys ever to get captured, certainly, and they never really countenance the fact that they could be losing battles and losing ground. So they're not really prohibiting their guys from keeping diaries, unlike the Americans who prohibit it because, or you're not supposed to. Some did, of course, but orders were that you weren't supposed to for that very reason. But the Japanese don't have that. And so not only are you capturing this stuff, you've got a priority and you've got skilled personnel to translate it and preserve it. And so someone like me can come along all these decades later and see this. And it's really neat because if I'm discussing the Battle of Buna, I can then piece together maybe where this guy was who was keeping a diary. And then you get a really good sense of the Japanese experience, not necessarily from the high command level, which we always have, but from the average soldier's level. And I think that's profoundly important. So that was a little bit of a wow moment for me.
I was going to say that the very fact that you could find something at that level, the boots on the ground, the grunts that you've written about as well, separately, because that frequently is a lot of the untilled ground that historians are fortunate to come across in many regards.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm curious about you and the Gilder Lehrman History Prize. That's one of those things where people who are into history and into writing and into books, that's like an Emmy or an Oscar or something. I mean, it's huge.
It is.
Could you tell us a little bit about? Can you step back and recall what your reaction was when you received it?
It's really a dream come true, honestly. And I was just thunderstruck. I was absolutely floored when I found out that Fire and Fortitude was going to be a finalist. I knew going in that a World War II book had never received the Gilder Lehrman. I don't know that there was anything calculating against it, but we're talking about all of military history here. So there's a lot to cover and consider. And so there's many, many books that are in play. And I remember, the day I got the call, it's again, just kind of, you talked about wow moments. It's really kind of hard to believe because, I mean, certainly any author would love to believe that their work deserves that and whatever else. But let's be honest, there's a lot of great historians doing incredible work, including the other books that were finalists. All of them would have been so deserving, and many others that weren't finalists. So it was very gratifying to me, though, beyond just whatever, the excitement is to receive that kind of literary prize, that the committee recognized the importance of the topic. That I thought, okay, they kind of see it my way in that regard, that this is original, that this is important. And so what I hoped too, as I mentioned a moment ago, is maybe this would stimulate more study, that it would bring more eyeballs onto the topic. And I felt that was all the good, because that's really kind of what I wanted to do with this anyway. And so the Gilder Lehrman can be one example of that. One thing that might help foster a bit more interest in the Army in the Pacific, which I tend to think is an endlessly fascinating topic, but I also think it's an important topic. So, once you get past the individual excitement, I think that's really what lasts more so, I hope.
So I've got another audience question. In your book, Deadly Sky. I think you use the American first-person correspondence and diaries to bring out a unique perspective on the air war in Europe. I find this to really bring grit and detail into what we often view from a strategic point of view. You see more books with that methodology in your future?
It's a good question. I think I'll always have the methodology of going to the firsthand accounts. I think that is just no one can tell us what it was like more than the people who were there. I mean, we should always be respectful and learn from that. Um, the Deadly Sky, writing that book was, or researching the book was so enjoyable because, as a guy who's a grunt historian for the most part, dealing with infantrymen who couldn't really keep diaries because of the reality of what they're, they don't want to carry anything new and they're in the rain and the mud and whatever. These airmen were keeping incredible detailed diaries and firsthand accounts when they got back to base. It was just like finding these new riches. So Deadly Sky, I think, is sort of animated with that kind of excitement that these sources exist. Whether I'll ever approach another topic like that again just kind of depends whether there's something that I think is new and that hasn't been covered in the same way. That is within my area of expertise, because I don't pretend to be a multilingual scholar or really be able to take you deep into the Soviet view of the war and all this. I am a primarily trained American historian, and that's what interests me most. And I think there's a lot to cover there anyway. So whatever might fall within that sweet spot, I guess I wouldn't rule it out, but would have to be something that I think is profoundly original.
So, are you working on something beyond the next book at this point?
Yeah, there's absolutely, the authors always have thoughts of what they're going to be taking on in the future. And I think probably the direction that I'm going to go is biography, because over the years, I've gotten more interested in senior level leadership. I've seen the really profound importance of personality in leadership and the dynamic of how that works. And you see it in a command setting and in a staff setting and all that. And you see it in the regular old civilian world too. And I think as I've gotten older, I found that more appealing and more important. And I do think that there's a lot to learn from that respect. And you can tell, like in this series, I'm taking you very deep into the world of the senior officers and how their interplay they've got too. So it's only natural that I've gotten more interested in that myself. And of course, sometimes there's really good source material. So I'm probably going to go in that direction, I think.
So, as we bring this conversation to a close, is there anything you want to say about the final book in the trilogy?
Yeah, the final book will cover, of course, 1945, and I think it will probably start, probably with the invasion of Luzon, which, the thing about that, this Philippines campaign is just absolutely enormous. By January 1945, MacArthur's theater is second in the world among American theaters, only to Eisenhower in Europe. He's got enormous resources. You have massive manpower. You have enormous ground battles going on in addition to all the the sea fights, the air fights, and all this. And so I'll take you there, and then of course you see this sort of other subplot of Okinawa and everything that means too. I think the Battle of Okinawa is a profound and affecting battle on so many levels, and I think it's important to study. And I've tried to give you the sort of American point of view, the Japanese point of view, the Okinawan point of view, all melded together in this kind of larger narrative. And you see the command tension there too, the inter-service issues, and you don't see as much of that as in MacArthur's theater because it's such an army-dominated theater, and the naval commanders he's got with him, like Admiral Tommy Kincaid, knew him very well by the spring of 1945. So all of that will be in play, in addition, of course, to what happens to the POWs. You may know or remember that there's 4 POWs who might follow through this series of different ranks and experience. General Wainwright, of course, who's quite famous and is the ranking POW. And you see, of course, what happens with him in the 1945 volume. Johnny Johnson, Harold K. Johnny Johnson, who's a field grade in World War II, and is so mistreated that he ends up below 100 pounds at one point, and yet somehow survives. And of course, someday he's going to be Army Chief of Staff. But you really kind of get to know him. And then two enlisted soldiers, Lester Tenney, who was a tanker from Chicago, who goes through unreal experiences, and another guy named Campbell, Michael Campbell, an infantryman, a private, and you kind of see his odyssey too. So you'll see that play out at the end of 1945 when they're liberated. In addition, of course, to what happens in China, which is another aspect of this that is so incredibly significant. Because you're seeing, of course, the vestiges of the beginning of the Chinese Civil War, which, of course, we could argue is the most consequential event of the 20th century in the sense that the People's Republic of China comes out of that, and two subsequent American wars are the result of that in many respects, Korea and Vietnam, and, of course, much less of what's going on today. So, all of that will be there for you in a big gulp in the 1945 Volume 3.
So how long do we have to wait till the big gulp?
Yeah, I wish I could tell you. It's most of it is written. I have to frame it a little bit differently because it was at one time, married to the 1944 side, and it was all going to be part of the same book. So there'll be a little bit of different framework, but and we don't, like I said, it's good to kind of pause from these and get ready for the next one, get some headspace for it because it's a very textured and rich story. So I don't know specifically. I don't think it'll be next year. But I don't think it'll be, a profoundly long time, though.
So here's what I would say. Number one, thank you for taking time to talk to us tonight. Number two, when we get back in the business of having live, in-person, on-site author events, I would hope you could come talk about Volume 3. And we do author programs like nobody else in the Army, and we want to roll out that Army hospitality for you.
That would be great.
I know that you would be welcome and an incredible visitor to us at Fort Knox. And so just know the invitation is out right now to try and work this out when the time comes.
Awesome.
So we're gonna plan on that, and I'm gonna get with. I'll keep in touch with you, and I'll keep in touch with your publicity team here, and we're going to see you in person. So everybody have a great night. Thank you.
Thanks.